Trying to apprehend an arsonist is extremely difficult. Only 1% of arsonists are actually detected. Traditionally, they're very versatile criminals. They are furtive, and I think sometimes they set out to kill. In fact, sometimes they do.
Black Saturday was a day of horrendous fires throughout Victoria. 173 people died on Black Saturday. 11 people died in Churchill.
It's one of the investigations I'll never forget. I remember the arson squad for a number of years, but this is the biggest and probably the most memorable one, the one that'll stay with me forever.
I instantly thought, how could anybody do this? It seemed incomprehensible to me that somebody could deliberately light a fire. So the question that I asked myself was, what makes an arsonist? Who would do this and why?
We now know from satellite evidence that there are 4,500 fires per week in Australia, and 40% of them are deliberately lit.
I think that if you don't look closely at this story and don't examine all of the parts, then you miss an opportunity to understand why these fires are occurring. Churchill is in Victoria's Latrobe Valley, in the foothills of the Strzelecki's. This country was incredibly conducive to an out-of-control feral fire, especially with gale force winds and a temperature of 46 degrees.
Well, in the week before it was really quite bad. We'd had some fairly hot, dry weather. We'd had some pre-planning meetings, and so we were all really quite prepared for Black Saturday when it actually turned into a fire day. We had a number of fairly small fires earlier in the day, which we dealt with. And then we got the call to the Glendonald Road fire. And as soon as we turned around and saw the smoke in the sky, we knew it was going to be horrible, absolutely horrible.
Emergency services.
0101. I can see a fire in the pine plantation near Churchill.
I can see a pine plantation behind your property along Glendonald Road.
Yes.
Is that where it is?
Yes.
Just over on the hill to the west of us, there was a cloud brewing. And I said, oh, look, the southerly changes here, that's good. And I think the son said, that's not a cloud, that's smoke.
It happened so quickly on that day. Within a minute of my wife seeing a little plume of smoke, it was a raging bushfire. The smoke was like an atomic explosion. I then looked across into the gully up here, and it was probably the most evil thing I've ever seen. It was just a searing red mess, flames going in all directions. And I thought, if that's hell, I've seen it. And I thought, run, boy, run. And I ran.
We were sitting there and we just didn't know anything was happening. A neighbour, he came up the hill and said, look, there was a fire here and you have to get out in a hurry.
She and her husband Bill got their dogs and very little else. As they were leaving, their son Colin pulled up the drive and Bill fought with him with some ferocity to try to get him off the block. He couldn't change his son's mind and left. Colin was shortly joined by his brother David.
We went to stay at David's house and the boys rang up. They said, well, the fire's gone through now. Everything's okay. We're going in to have a rest and we'll be home shortly. And he said, I love you, Mum.
There was then a wind change at about 6 p.m, which added a new store of oxygen to this already out of control fire.
About an hour or so later, they hadn't arrived home, and I said to Bill, the boys are dead. And he said, oh, don't be stupid. And I said, yes, they are. They wouldn't leave me this long without telling me that they were safe. And I knew that they'd gone. I knew at 9 o'clock they'd gone. My neighbours said the house imploded.
People were killed in the blaze at Churchill in Gippsland.
To make matters worse, police suspect arsonists have again been at work.
They're investigating the possibility that that person is responsible for the Churchill fire.
I got called in to probably the most confronting briefing I'll ever get. I remember an ashen-faced detective sergeant delivering that briefing to us, and it wasn't as if we knew what to do. There's no training that can prepare you for receiving that news, so it did take us a little bit of time to come up with a plan.
The hunt for the arsonists suspected of being involved in the country's worst natural disaster is in full swing.
To actually apprehend an arsonist, you need a team of diligent, skillful arson detectives.
There's a lot of devastation through here.
Oh, it is that stump. I met the arson chemist, George Exidius, and we were able to identify the area where the fire occurred. And from that examination, we were able to identify 2 seats of fire.
It all came back to this one area here on this side of the track. The other point of origin was just at the intersection here. One point of origin, you can say possibly accidental, but certainly two distinct locations, it's not possible.
That was what led them to be positive somebody had deliberately lit the fire.
We became aware of Brendan Sokaluk's existence on the Wednesday following Black Saturday, and then throughout that night we gathered quite a bit of evidence which tended to make the case against Brendan stronger and stronger.
Yesterday afternoon, police arrested a 39-year-old Gippsland man.
The accused can now be identified as Churchill man Brendan Sokaluk.
Sokaluk is accused of deliberately lighting the fire.
I drove to Churchill to have a look around. I suppose I was looking for some clue as to who he was and why, if the police were right, he had done this. This is Brendan's house. Obviously, it's abandoned now. There were clues there as to why someone might have lit a fire. When the police came to arrest him, they found a private junkyard. His neighbours told the police that he had a habit of lighting a lot of fires in his back garden. On New Year's Eve, some people at a party observed a fire that was, they claimed, about 5 feet high. On the morning of Black Saturday, Brendan went with his father on a shopping trip. They laid some bets at the TAB and they stopped at Kentucky Fried Chicken. As they drove home, they saw the local CFA responding to a grass fire and stopped to watch. Brendan dropped his father back at his parents' home.
Brendan then bought some cigarettes. That was at 1:16 p.m. He drove along Glendonald Road and then went off the actual road and onto an access track next to a eucalypt plantation.
13 hours, 32 minutes.
Emergency services. We need the fire brigade, please.
Glendonald Road, Churchill.
At some point, he contacted 000.
Okay, the brigade have been notified of that, and hopefully we can get there as soon as possible. I'll just grab your name and number if I could.
Brendan, it's getting big.
Okay, I'll let them know that.
Okay, then.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Bye.
Bye.
Brendan returned home. He spent the rest of the afternoon standing on the roof of his house watching the fire as it progressed.
He then walked back into the fire zone.
The fire front created a fireball and it came straight over the top of the house. Brendan walked down this driveway and my son met him somewhere around here. Liam said to me, "Don't you think it's strange that someone would come down a driveway in the middle of a fire carrying a dog?" And I said, "Well, that is a bit strange."
He turned up and offered to assist, inserting himself into the story not as the perpetrator, but as the hero who comes to save the day.
Like many arson cases, this was a circumstantial case. There was no one witness who saw Brendan in the bush leaning down and lighting a fire. All in all, there were about 160 witnesses who had something to do with Brendan's movements on the day. And every one of them in a chain delivered a very, very strong circumstantial case.
Now, Brendan, do you agree that you were placed under arrest by the policeman? And they informed you that you're not obliged to say or do anything, but anything you say or do may be given in evidence. Do you remember that?
Not really. Didn't take much notice.
Okay. Do you remember that they told you what offence that you're under arrest for?
I'll say yes, but I don't remember. So who's the bad man in the suit?
There's no bad man in the suit.
When Paul Bertoncello and his colleagues arrested Brendan, they felt very early on that Brendan was putting on a kind of act of the village idiot to try to disrupt the interview process.
What's your full name?
Brendan J. Sokaluk.
What does the J stand for?
Can't remember.
Okay.
He told us that he was responsible for starting the fire, but it was an accident.
I was smoking and a bit of the thing fell off onto the floor, so I used a bit of paper to pick it up. And I didn't properly like squish it out sort of thing, and when I threw the paper at the rotor, it ignited. I didn't know. It was too late. I panicked and left the area.
What happened then?
I called AAA. I did a bad thing and I was scared shit. Scared about it.
Brendan, did you mean to light the fire but not mean to hurt people?
I didn't mean any of this to happen. I thought it was out when I threw it out the paper and shit out the window. I had no intention for this all to happen. Now I've got to put up for the rest of my life. And it makes me sad.
One of the few facts that we had in our possession at that time was that there were 2 points of origin. That made the entire investigation a deliberately lit fire.
No.
Him making an admission or a confession of sorts to starting one of those fires didn't account for the other fire.
How do you know this area? Just where I threw my piece of paper out the window. Right. Where do you think you did that? In this area here somewhere. Right. Show me exactly where you think.
Brendan was to later admit to having started the fire to his father on the telephone.
Did you do it or not?
I don't think I did.
What do you mean you don't think?
I think it's a bit more of an accident than it was.
What do you mean it was more of an accident?
Well, as far as I know, a bit of paper that accident was out before I threw it out the car window. If that ignited, then I'm guilty, but I don't think it would have.
Brendan Sokaluk was charged with 10 counts of arson causing death.
At that time, I was working at Morwell Legal Aid, and the managing lawyer at the time came in and said, well, they've arrested somebody for Black Saturday. You're the barrister. Let's go to court. So we did.
Selina McCrickard was perhaps the one person in that town who was prepared to show him support and act as his voice.
When I first met Brendan, it was obvious to me that he was really operating on a different plane. He was this man charged with obviously a very, very serious set of offences, and his reaction to that was very blunted. Brendan, I think, was always a loner. He wasn't a normal kind of kid, and he wasn't accepted by the community.
People felt no shame calling him a retard or a veggie.
Brendan did suffer a significant amount of bullying, and it got to a point where it could only be described as extreme. So here were his parents collecting him from the bus. He's covered in feces, sometimes he's covered in spit. He was harangued on a regular basis.
Brendan left high school in year 11, and it was unclear whether he could read or write. He joined the Churchill CFA. There were suspicions that Brendan was appearing at fires he couldn't have known about, and that he was perhaps deliberately lighting them.
He wasn't in the brigade for very long. He was eventually removed from the brigade.
After high school, Brendan was hired as an assistant groundsman at the local university's campus under a disability scheme.
I said to Brendan on one occasion while we were working away, "You don't seem too dumb to me." And he goes, "Oh, I'm all right," he said. And he said, sometimes I've got to be assessed, and he said, you go in there and you slobber and you dribble and talk rubbish, and they think you're worse than what you are. He said, so I get all the benefits that way.
Brendan claims that he was treated as the punching bag. His colleagues claim that he was incredibly difficult. It's very difficult to say whether or not Brendan was a victim or a menace.
Brendan's ability to hold down a job was hampered by the fact that he was dealing with other individuals who had no education or understanding of how to deal with someone with special needs.
One of the key things to understand about Brendan is that after his arrest, he was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum with a borderline intellectual disability.
The first person to be charged over the bushfires has appeared in the Melbourne Magistrates Court.
Strong public emotion over the fires ensured there was huge interest in today's hearing.
Brendan has always maintained that he did not deliberately start the fire. The prosecution case was that there were definitely 2 points of ignition which were deliberately lit. He presented in court very much like a child of 8 or 9 years of age, or even younger.
There was a warring narrative that took place during this trial. On one hand, there was this cunning serial offender, and on the other, this hapless, naïf, caught up in events beyond his control. And I think that it's entirely possible that both of those versions were true.
During the investigation, it was my job to contact family members of deceased people. I had one phone with 30 messages saying that he's not guilty, and another phone with 30 messages saying he's guilty. When the verdict was read out and he was guilty, I was tremendously relieved to be able to press the send button on the phone. I'm not afraid to say I shed a tear when the verdict was read out.
Throughout the sentence, Sokaluk scribbled on a piece of paper, seemingly oblivious to what was going on in court. And he wore a puzzled expression as he learned he'll spend at least the next 14 years in jail.
The assembled barristers and solicitors went to visit him in the cells, and he hadn't realised that he'd just been found guilty. He was still asking them when he was going to be able to go home and see his dog. I understand that they left in tears.
Each one of the counts of arson causing death was punishable by a maximum sentence of 25 years imprisonment. As a result of the disabilities which Brendan suffered from, he was sentenced to 17 years and 9 months with a non-parole period of 14 years.
I thought it was pretty light, considering he'll be out in another 4 years.
My observations of that sentence was that it was extraordinarily fair. I'm sure that he did not intend that anyone should die.
I still personally cannot say for sure whether Brendan maliciously lit those fires with the intent to cause as much damage as he did.
The effect that the fires had on people's livelihood really was that their livelihoods were decimated. A lot of farming country was destroyed, a lot of stock was lost. That resulted in, well, really what can only be described as a depression of sorts in this area. While industry will recover to a certain extent, I wonder really if the victims of that fire will ever recover.
Hello, hello, how are you? Glad you're here.
Meeting Shirley Gibson for the first time was daunting.
The babies are well? They're well. Come in.
The scale of her loss seemed so great.
I thought I was pretty weak, and I thought about it. I thought, no, I'm pretty strong. You know, I've got there. It's taken a long while, but I've got there. Over a period of time, I thought about Brendan. He didn't really mean to kill my boys. He didn't mean to kill any of those people. I can understand now what's happened, and there are people a lot worse off than I am. I know now that I have forgiven him. In my own heart, I know I've forgiven him, and I know if I met him, I would probably even shake his hand.
Some people, I think, forgive him to a certain degree. Others will never forgive him for what he did, considering that he never ever said he was sorry and never ever said that he actually did it.
And you?
I'll never forgive him. I hope he doesn't come back here for his own safety, and I don't ever want to see him again.
The only way is to prevent bushfires rather than responding after the fact, after the deaths, after the destruction. After Black Saturday, we set up the National Centre for Research in Bushfire and Arson. We knew that there was really no way of reducing or preventing bushfires unless we dealt with the human element. What we needed to do was to engage the community to get them to support reporting arsonists in their community. What can we do about the arsonist, the individual who is lighting fires, and what kind of person are we dealing with? I would say that Brendan does fit the profile of an arsonist, a lone male arsonist who is older. We as a community need to help one another learn what those clues are so that the next time we've got a Brendan in our midst, this information can be passed through to you guys. Over the next 4 years, we are going to have a heat wave globally. It's getting more dangerous. The more dangerous it becomes, the greater likelihood we have that when a match is lit, it'll take. So we've got to focus on primary prevention. The only way we can stop the Brendans of this world from continuing to light fires is to bring them in for intervention and treatment before they struck the first match.
Brendan Sokaluk is a product of the community that he grew up in, a community that had very little understanding of people with autism or other mental health issues.
Could it be that he lit this fire to revenge those who'd thought he was a retard and a veggie, and then to be the hero who saves them?
If he had have had more support when he was growing up, things may have ended very differently.
It's very easy to say, lit it, bang him up. Yeah, that's fixed that problem. Well, hang on, what if we're building another one? You also got to say, well, why? Why did that happen? Now let's deal with the why, and we might actually prevent the next one from happening.